The story of the Transfiguration in Mark's gospel stands at the exact center point of that particular piece of work. It's the middle, it's the hub, it's the center. It's also one of those stories that we never know quite what to do with. The Transfiguration is full of mystery and light, hard to understand. What is it that the disciples have seen? What is it that happened on that mountaintop? What has to do with Moses and Elijah and everything else? To understand this particular part of Mark, it helps me to note that there are two stories that start the section. In the 8th chapter, we hear a story about a man born blind who Jesus gives his sight to. And then at the end of chapter 10, we hear another story about blind Bartimaeus who is given his sight. Two blind men, that's the bookends of this part of Mark. And so we should be clued in as we read the story that this is somehow about seeing. It's about seeing things the way they are. And what the eyes of faith tell us and what the revelation of Christ tells us is that there is always in this world more than meets the eye. That first story of a blind man who was healed, Jesus encounters him and he calls out and asks to be healed. So Jesus takes him aside and he makes some mud from his spit and the dirt on the ground, and he puts it over his eyes, and then he asks him to open his eyes and tell him what he can see. And the man says, well, I can see now a little bit, but all the people look like trees. They're just kind of blobs. I don't see it very well. And so Jesus once again repeats the act, and then he can see clearly. Now, when you first read that, you think, is Jesus just is this like his internship? And, you know, he's trying to get the hang of this whole giving sight to the blind thing, and he kind of messes it up the first time. That's probably not what Mark is trying to tell us, that Jesus didn't quite get it right the first time. No, I think there's a much deeper clue. There's a deeper meaning to what he's saying. You see, I think what Mark is trying to remind us is that when Jesus is revealed to us, our sight, our view of the world doesn't come immediately like that. It takes walking with Jesus. It takes many, many times where he calls us into life with him before our vision finally clears and we can see the world the way he sees it. Until then, we're just seeing trees. And then maybe they look like bushes. And then maybe, well, we're blind again. And then, well, you get the picture. It takes us time in order to have our sight restored. And that's the story that happens between these two blind men being healed. Jesus encounters Pharisees, rabbis, his own disciples, and none of them can see. Every time he asks them a question, they don't get the answer right. Every time he has a controversy, they don't get what he's saying. Little bit by little bit, they begin to see what this Jesus is about, and they begin to see what it is that Jesus is trying to tell them. The world is not what it seems. There's more to it than we can see. All the stories today in Scripture are about seeing. In the first wonderful story that we have about the passage of prophetic authority from Elijah, perhaps the greatest prophet ever to live in Israel, and Elisha, his disciple and student, takes place. Many of you maybe sung Sunday school songs or hymns in your youth that talked about this miraculous taking up of Elijah into heaven by a chariot of fire. It's the only person in the Old Testament in faith at all who never seems to die. He's just taken up. Although one can argue maybe it happened with Moses too. He just disappeared on top of the mountain. Elisha has been the faithful disciple of Elijah, moving from place to place, doing the prophetic work of God. And Elijah, well, he has defeated the prophets of Baal. on their own mountain. Elijah has endured the famine and fed a widow and raised her son. Elijah has taken on the political power of Ahab and Jezebel and brought them down from their throne. Elijah has done mighty things, wearing camel hair and a leather belt, eating locusts and living in the wilderness. And Elisha has picked up the call to be trained by him. So at the end of Elijah's term as the prophet of Israel, he goes to Gilgal, and he tells Elisha, "The Lord has told me to go to Gilgal, you can stay here." Elisha says, "No, I'm not staying here. As long as you live and as the Lord lives, I'm sticking with you." This isn't disobedience. This is a formula we hear throughout the Old Testament of faithfulness and dedication. It's what Ruth says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, "Wherever you go, I will go with you." That's what Elisha is saying to Elijah. Then when they get to Gilgal, he says, "I'm going on to Bethel, a holy place. You can stay here." And Elisha says no. His faithfulness demonstrated again. Then he says, "I'm going on to the Jordan. You can stay here." But he says, "No, wherever you go, I will go with you." And they exit the land of Israel by going across the Jordan. They do so in the same fashion as the people crossed the Red Sea. Elisha takes off his mantle and he whacks the water with it, and the waters part. And the two of them go across on dry ground, leaving the promised land behind and going into the wilderness. Then Elijah, the master, turns to his tutee, and he says to Elisha, "What can I give you? What do you want?" And Elisha says, "Give me a double share of your spirit." Now, if you've read the story of Elijah, I mean, talk about somebody full of the Spirit. This is a big request. And Elijah says that to him. "You've asked something very hard." But then notice what he says. He says, "When I am taken up, if you see me taken up, if your eyes perceive me taken up into heaven, then you will receive the gift. If you do not see it, well, then you won't." And it immediately happens. The chariot appears and takes Elijah up into heaven. Now, I don't think this means that if you happen to be here, if when the chariot comes, everybody will be able to see it, and Elisha might miss it because he's on his cell phone. Elisha might miss it because he went off to the little boys' room, the porta potty out in the middle of the wilderness. Elisha wasn't paying attention. That's not what's going on here. If the eyes of faith allow him to see the glory of heaven taking his master up, then it will be a sign that the faith is already in him and the Spirit's already been given. This isn't a gift given by Elijah, it's a gift given by God. All Elijah is saying, if you got it, we'll know it. And so the chariot of fire comes down from heaven and scoops up Elijah, and Elisha sees it fully, watches him disappear into the distance, calling out that it looks like the very host of Israel has come together in the glory of God. Elisha sees more than there seems to be. I speculate that, all those other prophets in this story, there were prophets at Bethel, and there were prophets at Jericho, and there were prophets who were at Gilgal. They're all telling him that Elijah's going to be taken up. I'm going to guess that if they'd all been assembled at this moment too, not all of them would have seen. For some, it would have been like trees. For some, they wouldn't have seen it at all because they couldn't believe their eyes. You see, the glory of God is apprehendable through eyes of faith. God peels back the glory of heaven, and for the faithful, they get a glimpse of that, which then sustains them to go into the world and do what God calls them to do. And Elisha does a lot. Elijah, his master, may be more famous, but Elisha's going to raise the dead. Elisha is going to feed the hungry in ways that are hearkened to when Jesus feeds the thousands that he feeds with bread and fish. Elisha is going to cure the leprosy of the general of the army of Israel's most noted enemy, Naaman. Elisha is going to do many deeds of power sustained by this image of grace, sustained by this glimpse of glory and grace that is given to him through the eyes of faith. Elisha don't see trees, he sees God's grace. Same thing happens in the Transfiguration. 3 disciples, 3 rather clueless disciples, and when you read the Gospel of Mark, they're clueless every single time. They are the rocky ground who, the minute things get bad, run away from the gospel. Peter, impetuous, always speaks before he thinks, and perhaps before he sees. So Jesus takes them up to a high mountain. It doesn't tell us which one. It says 6 days later, which is the same language when Moses went to Sinai and received the covenant tablets. 6 days he prepared with those who he worked with, Joshua and others. So he takes them up onto a high mountain, and as they gather around, all of a sudden he is transfigured. He is changed, he is transformed, he is filled with light, and he begins to shine with the glory of heaven. His whole presence, his whole persona begins to shine with a radiant light. We're reminded of Moses, who after being in the presence of God, shined with the glory of God so much that the people were afraid, and Moses had to wear a mask so as not to frighten them. Jesus shines with a whiteness that you can't even bleach clean. There isn't anything that could make this earthly, white, glowing glory. So the disciples are overwhelmed by this sight. They see it, but they can't believe what they're seeing. Peter, trying to get control of the situation, says, "Oh, there's Moses and Elijah with you," because they show up to the party as well, the 2 others who have seen the glory of God and participated in it. And he says, "We should build tents so we can stay here forever. We should build tents because we kind of like it up here, and too bad for the rest of those disciples." And then a cloud descends and says, "This is my son, my beloved," and gives us the best instruction for disciples ever. Listen to him. Obey him. Follow him. That's what it means. And then as quickly as it happened, it's over. There on the mountain, God peels back the very veil of heaven and allows the glory of God to enter in, and those disciples who are gathered see a glimpse of it, even if they only see it like trees. And then they go back down the hill again. But they are sustained by this vision to go and do the work that God has given them to do. It's why Transfiguration Sunday is right before we go into Lent. It is the peeling back of a little glory of God to now sustain us for the Lenten journey, which will be dark and hard and full of discipleship, which will call us to pray and give our alms and to fast. That's what God does. God gives us glory so that we can see the world as it truly is, so that we can have a glimpse of the grace and mercy of God in the world. Now, most of us, I think, would say, if that would happen to me, then I'd be a real believer. I mean, if I go out and get in the SUV or the car after church here, and all of a sudden the whole building and the parking lot begins to glow, and Jesus, Moses, and Elijah shows up, I'm sold. But you know what? Transfigurations happen, in my mind, every single day. When the people of God, through eyes of faith, trade in the eyes of selfishness and greed and glory so that they can have the eyes of compassion, faith, mercy, and love, then people stop looking like trees and they begin to become the people that God called them to be. I think of the work that Cindy and I have been doing with Mosaic and their National Leadership Council, where we get a chance to hear the stories of the people's lives that are touched by Mosaic. I think of one that we heard the last time we gathered, and we suffered while you guys were in the throes of the, polar vortex. We went to Phoenix. So they told us the story of Michael. Michael, who is severely autistic. Michael, who is nonverbal. Michael, who now as an adult is 6'4" and black. And so when you put all that in a shaker and you present him in front of most people, they back away 10 steps and they look for the nearest 20-foot pole. Because who wants to have anything to do with a Michael who's severely autistic, nonverbal, big, and black? But Mosaic has put him in a home where he lives with someone who treats him as a human being, who sees him as Michael. And Michael, no longer on 15 medications to simply sedate him into drooling in the corner so that he isn't a mess to anybody else, has become a vibrant young man who goes to the park and plays with the dog and fits in with the rest of the family. You see, that's because somebody saw Michael, saw him as Jesus sees him. That's a transfiguration right there, isn't it? Or the people who come to our food pantry, and they're labeled by the world as simply hungry losers, people who should have enough sense to get themselves out of their trouble. But we don't see them that way. We see them the way Jesus sees them. And so in love and kindness, we let them take the food that they need so that they can live for another week and be sustained by the love of God. That's a transfiguration right there. The glory of God, the curtain of heaven is pulled back, and we see a glimpse of the grace and mercy of God. It happens all the time in this world that we are allowed through eyes of faith to see the world as it really is and to see the more that is there than what the world tells us. The world is not just full of transactions and getting the most stuff. The world is not, as most of our politicians define it, or as the powers of this world define it. The world is as Jesus has revealed it. Today, you've gathered in this place so that we might share yet another transfiguration of the Lord. Isaiah tells us in the 25th chapter that on the final day, when the consummation of the kingdom comes, all the nations of the world, all the peoples of the world will be gathered on a mountain, and God will prepare a rich feast for them. Until that day, we will gather for a foretaste of that feast every time we come, and we have the promise of Jesus Christ that he will be present in body and in blood. He will be as present to us in this meal as he was on that mountain with Peter, James, and John. He will be as present as he was in the very beginning of creation. He will be as present as he is in the midst of the lives of those who suffer and who hunger. You see, to see the world as Jesus sees the world is to see Jesus in it. And so in simple bread and wine, the curtain of heaven will be pulled back. You'll get to see and to taste and to hear and to feel heaven come to you. And then you'll be sent back out into the world to be the hands and feet of Jesus. Just like Elisha, just like Peter, James, and John, just like everybody who has gone in the name of Christ to see and to deal with the world as more than it seems. The world's a holy place, even though it doesn't seem that way. The world is a loving place, even though it doesn't seem that way. It is the eyes of faith that help us to see. So, as our theme throughout Epiphany has been, come and see. Come to the table and see the grace and mercy of God. Come to the Word of God and see that God is constantly pulling back the curtain of glory and grace so that we might glimpse enough of it that we can go out into the world, even if we see things as trees yet, and do the work that God has called us to do. To love, to be changed, to be compassionate, to be kind. Come and see, my brothers and sisters. Come and see the glory of the Lord, because it happens all the time, and it's going to happen here at this table on this day. Amen.